As you begin your academic career at Tri-C, it's important to realize not only what plagiarism is, but also how to avoid it. This presentation will take you through the basics of plagiarism, but remember, if you have questions about this topic after seeing this presentation, you can always reach out to our Writing Center, our English tutors, or librarians for further assistance. Usually when people hear the word plagiarism, they think of someone taking someone else's paper or assignment, maybe even purchasing a paper. But it's important to realize that plagiarism also includes taking someone else's ideas and not giving them credit. So, for example, intentional plagiarism might be when you take a classmate's paper, take their name off of it, and turn it in as your own. Most people know that that's not okay. Unintentional plagiarism, on the other hand, goes back to that idea of taking someone's ideas and not saying that you got those ideas from that person. So for example, if I had an English paper and I went to the library and I found a book or a couple of articles, I read those sources, I wrote my paper, I put everything in my own words, but I didn't put any citations in that paper to indicate that I had read those sources, technically I would still be guilty of plagiarism. Now there are a couple of different varieties of plagiarism. Copy and paste plagiarism is the one that most people are familiar with. And it's important to realize that whether it's a paragraph from a website, or an entire chapter out of a book, or even a couple of sentences, it still counts as plagiarism if you're taking something directly from a source without quoting it or citing it. And it's important to realize, especially if you're transferring to a four-year school, that a lot of colleges and universities across the country now use plagiarism detection software such as SafeAssign or Turnitin.com. If a paper is processed through those sites, they actually scan the entire internet looking for sentences or paragraphs that match up with websites. So it's important for us to be aware of citing and quoting to avoid being flagged for plagiarism. Paraphrasing plagiarism, we just touched on a little bit. It's when you've done your own research, you've found materials, you've typed your paper, but maybe you forget to put a citation in that tells your reader, in most cases your professor, hey, I got this idea from this book, this website, this magazine. So remember, it doesn't matter if you're using an online source or a print source. If you watched it, read it, or listened to it to write your paper or do a presentation, you need to cite your source and say that you watched it, read it, or listened to it. Now there are a couple of exemptions to this. One of them is if you're using common knowledge in your paper. The best way to describe common knowledge is that if you can be reasonably sure that the average person walking down the street would know something, that's common knowledge and you don't need to provide a citation for it. So the examples here: smoking is bad for you, the capital of the United States is Washington, D.C. Maybe even something like coal mining can damage the environment. Most people may be aware of that, but you want to make sure that you don't get stuck in the trap of thinking that something might be common knowledge. So for example, if you're in an English class, and from the very first assignment that you have until the end of the semester, maybe you're sticking with the same topic and just doing different assignments around that topic. By the end of the semester, that topic might feel like common knowledge to you because of how familiar you've become with it. So just remember, assume that the average person walking down the street would also need to know that information before you could consider it to be common knowledge. The other time when you wouldn't need to include a citation is if you're using your own mind to write your paper. So in other words, your analysis or your opinion of a source that you used. In those cases, we're talking about your own thoughts, your own feelings, your own opinions. So even if you start a paragraph with John Smith on page yada yada argues that, such and such, if you're then going to be talking about what you think of Mr. Smith's article, or why you think it's wrong or right, that's going to be coming from you. You don't need to cite that part of it, you just need to cite what Smith originally said. So here's an example of copy and paste plagiarism. One thing that I'd like you to pay attention to is that the underlined portion here on either one of the examples are identical. So on the left-hand side, we have a couple of sentences, maybe one sentence from an original source. On the other side, this is, let's just say, a paper that I've been writing. So most plagiarism software out there, and possibly your professor, would flag this underlined portion on the right-hand side as being plagiarized. So there are a couple of reasons for that. Number one, even though this is half of a sentence, it's still 13 or so words. That's enough words in order that it's not really a coincidence that they show up that way. When you've got that many words in a row that match another source, it's not even about being a complete sentence, it's just that's still a pretty decent number of words. The other part of it is, if you actually take a minute and read that sentence, the crusading movement, however important they deemed it in their pronouncements, was to them a rather peripheral matter. Most people don't write like that or speak like that in normal everyday life, right? So the fact that that's a really unique, almost academic way of writing would definitely make a professor's eyebrows raise if they read that after they've already read a couple of things that maybe you've written for a discussion post or a reflection. So if you see something like that, maybe it's a good thing to include, but put it in your own words. So for example, even though people said the crusading movement mattered to them, in the end, they didn't really think it was that big of a deal. Now, here's an example of paraphrasing plagiarism. On the left-hand side, we have a couple of sentences from an original article, the author of which is Harry Schmuck. So he wrote this article called Dag Blasted Mining Companies that was published in the Journal of Southern Mining Issues in 2014, and the article's about 12 pages long. So this is an important piece of information that I wanted to include in my paper. So on the right, you can see that I've kind of summarized or paraphrased the meaning that was in those two sentences on the left, but there's a missing piece here, and that is the in-text citation. The average person on the street would not know that the bucket of a drag line is big enough to hold nearly 24 small cars. That's really specific information. So what I should have done there to make this not paraphrasing plagiarism is to include an in-text citation that says what page of that article that I got the information from, as well as the last name of the author. So we've talked about citing a little bit already. To cite something, there's kind of a two-piece formula. The first part is an in-text citation, and those are placed throughout the body of your paragraph. So as an example, usually it's the last name of the author of your source that you're using and the page number where the information comes from. Those in-text citations, so let's just say Smith 12, would point toward a more detailed citation on your Works Cited page. So on the Works Cited page, for example, we might find that Smith is actually Barbara Smith, who wrote an article called The Effectiveness of Library Instruction for Graduate Psychology Students. And maybe we find out that that article was published in the Journal of Social Psychology in 2016 in issue number 1 on pages 200 to 235. The Works Cited page has a lot more detail, which allows people to track down that information if they wanted to read it themselves. Now, the reason why citing is so important is kind of a threefold thing. First off, college policies and your student handbook both say, don't plagiarize. It's bad. So the simple version is, don't do it because you're not allowed to. But there's also kind of an ethical component here too. So for example, if you came up with a really great idea and someone took it and used it without saying, you know, I originally got this idea from Steve or Bob or Bill, well, you'd be a little annoyed if that was your idea and no one ever gave you credit for it. When it comes to writing papers, it's the same principle. But the most important thing, I think, is that citing gives your paper additional credibility. Usually when we start writing papers in college, we might be interested in a topic, but we might not be an expert in that topic. By providing citations, as an author, you are saying, here's my main argument, and as supporting information, I'm relying on previous things written by this person, and this person. So when you're citing, you're actually helping yourself provide a stronger paper. So we know that an in-text citation, at its most basic level, tells your reader, in this case your professor, I read this thing, or listened to this thing, or watched this thing. And the middle line here just gives you a really basic example of what an in-text citation would look like, at least in MLA format. So it's usually just the author's last name and the page number where the information comes from. Now, this isn't perfect. Sometimes there might not be an author, for example, if you're using a website. Or if it's a website, those don't have page numbers. So there's a website that I always like to tell people about if they have questions about how to do an in-text citation. It's published by the Purdue OWL, or Online Writing Lab, and the easiest way to find it is just to do a Google search for OWL, like the bird, O-W-L, MLA. If you do a search for that site, the very first thing that comes up is the Purdue Online Writing Lab, and that will tell you how to create a citation for something with one author, 3 authors, 5 authors, no authors. So it's a great source to refer to. So when it comes to when you should be using in-text citations, we know that you don't need to worry about them if you're giving your own thoughts, opinions, feelings, or if it's common knowledge. But when you're quoting something, in other words, using the direct words from your source, you need to include a citation, or when you're summarizing or paraphrasing. Now, most of us use paraphrase and summarize interchangeably, but they're actually 2 different things. So, as an example, if I had read a 25-page article, and I only needed to use 1 or 2 sentences to say, here's the main argument of this article, well, that would be a summary. It's just in and out, really quick, bare bones information. A paraphrase is when I want to spend a little bit more time elaborating on that information. So I'd be saying, here's the author's main argument. Here's their first piece of supporting information, give some detail. Here's their second piece of supporting information, provide some detail. So quoting and summarizing are usually pretty short. Paraphrasing can be a little bit longer. And here's an example of a quote. Now, it's important that a quote be word for word from the source, and if you look at the example at the bottom, doing a citation for a quote is really similar to doing your standard run-of-the-mill in-text citation. The only difference is the part of the quote that you're taking from your original source just needs to be inside quotation marks. And I used this example for one good reason. You'll notice that it's half of a sentence. You don't need to copy an entire sentence or an entire paragraph, although you can as long as you quote it properly. But let's say that you start writing a sentence and then you realize that the source that you're looking at said it perfectly. That's the best time to use a quote. And depending on who your professor is, they might actually tell you that when you turn a paper in, it can't contain more than 10% quotes or 20% quotes. The reason for that is that your professor wants to hear what you have discovered and what you think about your topic. If half of your paper is quotes, they're reading half of what other people have already written as opposed to what you have found. Now, when we're talking about paraphrasing, that's basically just putting something in your own words. So the key thing here is you're not simply substituting synonyms in a sentence. And when we start writing at the college level, it can be really easy to develop a habit of thinking, okay, I've got the sentence. If I swap out this word and this word and this word in the sentence, I'll be okay. Well, it's actually harder to do that than to paraphrase a paragraph at a time. So if you think about switching out a few words in every sentence, that's going to eat up a lot of your life. But what I usually tell people is read a paragraph, then flip your paper over and explain what you just read to yourself. What you just did is paraphrasing. So once you can master that, it's actually going to become easier to write your papers. But remember, after you've paraphrased, since the idea came from somewhere else originally, you'll still need to say where it came from. This is an example of a paraphrase. Or to be more specific, since this is a very, very small amount of information, you could also call it a summary. So I'd like to take a minute here to have you read the top paragraph, and then to read the sentence at the bottom. Ask yourself if the sentence at the bottom is a good way of summarizing this, or if you would have said it differently. Now, if you would have said it differently, that's actually okay, because at the end of the day, a paraphrase doesn't have to sound like a professor or a librarian, it just needs to sound like you. So we talked a little bit about a works cited page, and like I said before, that includes all of the information that you'd need to track down the source that you used to write your paper. So again, this is a reminder that if you'd like more information on creating a works cited page, the OWL website is also really good for that as well. And again, all you'd need to do is Google OWL MLA or OWL APA. But another reminder here, if you go to the library and you use any of its online resources, all of them are going to have a button that generates citations that can go on your works cited page. So if you're ever using a library database like Opposing Viewpoints or Academic Search Complete, contact the library and they can always tell you how to use those citation generators. This is just a very quick example of the difference between an in-text citation like Gowdy 29 on the left versus Gowdy, John, avoiding self-organized extinction toward a co-evolutionary economics of sustainability on the right. So you can see on the right-hand side, all the information exists to track down Mr. Gowdy's article from the International Journal of Sustainable Development and World Ecology. So there's the main difference between the two. So imagine you're reading someone's paper and it's flowing along really well. Would you rather see Gowdy 29 or a 3-line long citation in the middle of a paper? So closing off, just a couple of quick things. Remember, when we start writing in college level, it might be easy to think that we don't need to cite something as long as we've put it in our own words. But remember, if you've watched it, read it, or listened to it, and you've used it to write your paper, you need to say where you got the information from. And some people may also be under the impression that if you've Googled something and it's on the internet and it's free, you don't need to worry about citing it. But like I said before, if you watched it, read it, or listened to it, even if it's an internet resource, you still need to say that you used it. Now, plagiarism has some different consequences. If you do it once in a class, it might be a reduction of the grade of the assignment. It might be an F on the assignment. You might even fail the course, and if it happens more than once, people can risk being suspended or kicked out of college. But professionally, people have actually lost their jobs or lost their incomes after people found out that they had plagiarized. And your coworkers can develop an unrealistic expectation of your skills. If you're going into medicine, law, nursing, plagiarizing can actually cause harm to other people. For example, if you really needed to learn something and instead you copied a paper, well, that might be information that one day might keep a person alive or out of jail. And just to show you that this isn't just a thing that occurs inside the halls of colleges and universities, if you go to Google News and do a search for the word plagiarized or plagiarism, you can almost always find a news story about a celebrity or someone who's being sued for plagiarism or accused of it. So it happens to other people outside of college. Now, the important thing here is just to know that this is an important issue, but you're not in this alone either. Like I said at the beginning of this recording, if you have questions, whether it's, did I cite this properly, or I need help with paraphrasing, there are departments at Tri-C who are here to help you. So if you need help with making a citation, come to the library. If you need help with paraphrasing or to make sure that something isn't plagiarized, stop by and talk to an English tutor or the Writing Center. We're here to support you at Tri-C, and we're happy to answer any questions that you have. I hope you found this video useful. Thank you for your time.